Chapter 8, The Great Depression to the Post-War Boom. Has the listener ever paused in the middle of a craft store aisle to truly consider the sheer, unadulterated miracle of a cheap, neon-orange ball of synthetic yarn? To the modern crafter, a skein of brightly colored acrylic purchased for a handful of dollars is a trivial thing. It is a humble, highly accessible supply meant for knitting a whimsical scarf, a slightly lopsided baby blanket, or perhaps a novelty sweater for a reluctant dachshund. It is soft to the touch, it is practically indestructible, and it smells faintly of absolutely nothing at all. But to truly understand how human beings arrived at the profound luxury of knitting purely for fun, and how the world ultimately ended up with the crocheted toilet seat cover, one must embark on a rather chaotic, highly flammable journey through time. It is a journey that begins in the grim, dust-choked depths of the Great Depression, winds its way through the highly toxic, vaguely unsettling chemistry laboratories of the mid-20th century, and concludes in the static-charged, heavily carpeted suburban living rooms of the 1970s. To understand the modern leisure of knitting, we must first strip away the cozy, tea-drinking, fireside romance of the craft. We must travel back to a time when knitting was not a hobby, but a brutal, tedious, life-or-death necessity. Welcome, dear listener, to the era of the Great Unraveling. The Great Unraveling. Let us step back into the early 1930s. The global economy has collapsed under its own weight. Unemployment in some regions is hovering around a staggering 33%, leaving millions of families entirely destitute. Cash is scarce, new clothing is an impossible luxury, and winter is advancing across the landscape with the same merciless, bone-aching chill it always has. In this era, a mother does not sit down to knit a sweater because she wants to unwind after a long day of work. She knits because if she does not, her children will suffer from the biting cold. But there is a glaring, immediate problem. There is absolutely no money to buy new yarn. The solution to this problem lies in the desperate, exhausting, and surprisingly complex art of reclaiming yarn from old, worn-out garments. In the modern knitting world, there is a specific, rather adorable term for undoing one's work. When a knitter makes a mistake on a current project, they must pull the needles out and rip the stitches back. If the mistake is only a few stitches back, the knitter engages in a process called tinking. What is tinking? It is simply the word knit, spelled backward. Tinking is a slow, methodical process of undoing one stitch at a time, effectively reversing the flow of time on the knitting needles. But if the mistake is massive, or if an entire garment must be destroyed, tinking is far too slow. The knitter must engage in total structural annihilation. The colloquial term for this is frogging. Why frogging? The etymology is delightfully simple and entirely phonetic. When a knitter grabs the working end of the yarn and pulls with force, ripping out dozens of stitches in a rapid, violent succession, they must rip it, rip it, rip it. Say it fast enough, and it sounds exactly like the croak of a bullfrog. Thus, the act of destruction became known as frogging. During the Great Depression, frogging was not a quick fix for a dropped stitch. It was a massive, systemic, household recycling operation. Imagine, if you will, a home where the patriarch's heavy wool work sweater has finally given up the ghost. The elbows are blown out, the cuffs are frayed into a stringy mess, and the garment smells of a decade of hard, sweaty labor. Today, such an item would be unceremoniously tossed into a landfill. But in the 1930s, this sweater could not be thrown away. It was a vital, irreplaceable storehouse of raw material. The women of the household would take this exhausted garment and begin the painstaking process of total deconstruction. First, the seams of the sweater must be located. This is no small feat in a garment that has been worn, stretched, and washed for years. Wool, being animal hair, is covered in microscopic, overlapping scales. Under the friction and moisture of daily wear, these scales lock together in a stubborn, matted embrace known as felting. Armed with a blunt tapestry needle, a sharp blade, or a specialized seam ripper, the knitter must hunt down the original binding threads, carefully snipping the garment into its constituent parts: the front panel, the back panel, the sleeves, and the collar. Once the panels are separated, the true frogging begins. The knitter grasps the end of the yarn and pulls. Stitch by stitch, the fabric dissolves. A knitted garment is essentially a continuous, interconnected series of suspended loops, known mathematically and structurally as a wale. When the structural integrity is breached and the yarn is pulled, the loops release each other in a cascading chain reaction. But the yarn that emerges from this violent process is not ready to be magically reknitted into a new garment. Has the listener ever unraveled a tightly bound braid of hair, only to find the hair underneath hopelessly, tightly crimped? Wool possesses a similar, stubborn physical memory. Because it was forced into the microscopic, undulating loops of a stockinette stitch, washed and worn for years, the unraveled yarn emerges from the sweater looking exactly like a pile of uncooked, instant ramen noodles. If one were to try and knit with this deeply kinked, exhausted yarn, the resulting fabric would be a lumpy, uneven, structurally compromised disaster. The tension would be entirely wrong, the gauge would be unpredictable, and the new garment would look like a terrible mistake. The yarn must be relaxed. The memory of its former life as an adult's work sweater must be thoroughly erased. To achieve this, the Depression-era knitter had to become a makeshift kitchen physicist. The kinky yarn could not simply be wound into a tight, spherical ball. It had to be formed into a large, loose loop known as a hank or a skein. This was often accomplished by wrapping the yarn around the back of a wooden dining chair, around a specialized wooden tool called a niddy-noddy, or perhaps around the outstretched arms of a highly patient, deeply bored child. Once the yarn was secured into a large loop, it was tied in figure eights with scrap string in 4 or 5 places to prevent a catastrophic, unmanageable tangle. Then, it had to be subjected to moisture and heat. There were 2 primary methods to accomplish this relaxation, both requiring significant, tedious labor. The first was the soaking method. The knitter would fill a basin or a wash tub with cold or tepid water, perhaps adding a tiny shaving of precious soap. The tightly coiled, kinky yarn would be submerged, gently pressed beneath the surface of the water and left to soak. The moisture slowly penetrates the core of the animal fiber, breaking down the weak hydrogen bonds that hold the keratin proteins in their crimped, looping shape. After a thorough soak, the heavy, wet yarn was carefully lifted out. It could not be wrung or twisted, lest it fell into an unusable clump. It was gently squeezed to remove excess water, rolled in a towel, and hung to dry. Often, to ensure the yarn dried perfectly straight, knitters would tie a small weight to the bottom of the hanging loop. A wash stone, a heavy soup can, or even a spare clothes hanger would apply just enough gravitational pull to stretch the fibers straight as they dried. The second method was faster, but it required a more active sort of danger: the steaming method. A pot of water or a tea kettle would be brought to a rolling boil on the kitchen stove. The knitter would place a lid slightly askew on the pot, leaving a narrow gap for a concentrated, hissing jet of steam to escape. Taking the single strand of kinky yarn, the knitter would slowly, carefully pull it directly through the plume of scalding steam. The intense, moist heat instantly relaxes the fibers. Right before the knitter's eyes, the squiggly, ramen-like string goes entirely limp and straight, magically resetting to its original, unknitted factory settings. It is a beautiful, deeply satisfying physical reaction to witness, though one fraught with the constant peril of second-degree steam burns to the fingers. Only after this entire, exhausting process, the unseaming, the frogging, the skeining, the soaking, the waiting, the drying, and the rewinding, could the knitter finally cast on a new project. The ghost of an adult man's sweater was resurrected, stitch by stitch, row by row, into a pair of warm socks for a toddler. It was an act of profound domestic magic, a testament to human resilience, but it was born entirely of desperation. It was a world where human beings were wholly dependent on the slow, expensive growth of animal hair and plant fibers to cover their vulnerable bodies. But behind the scenes, far removed from the dusty, struggling kitchens of the American working class, a completely different kind of revolution was brewing. In the glittering, well-funded, slightly terrifying laboratories of the 1930s, scientists were looking at the slow, laborious process of shearing sheep and harvesting cotton, and they were asking a rather audacious question. What if humanity could bypass the messy business of nature entirely? What if a scientist could pull a fluffy, perfectly uniform thread of yarn out of thin air, water, and prehistoric sludge? The chemical miracle. The story of modern knitting, and the explosion of brightly colored yarns that followed, cannot be told without a deep, slightly unsettling detour into the world of industrial chemistry. Let the listener shift their imagination from the Great Depression to the pristine, glass-filled laboratories of the E.I. DuPont de Nemours and Company, better known simply as DuPont, located in Wilmington, Delaware. DuPont was originally founded in the year 1802 as a manufacturer of gunpowder and explosives. By the 1920s, they had expanded their empire, but they were looking for the next great frontier. In December of 1926, DuPont's chemical director, a man named Charles M. Stein, circulated a memo to the company executives. He convinced them to fund a radical new program dedicated entirely to pure, fundamental science. They built a state-of-the-art laboratory that the resident chemists affectionately dubbed Purity Hall. Stein's goal was not necessarily to invent a specific, marketable product right away, but to explore the fundamental building blocks of matter. To lead this monumental charge, Stein wooed a brilliant, brooding organic chemistry lecturer away from Harvard University. His name was Wallace Hume Carothers. Carothers was deeply interested in a highly controversial theory of the time, the concept of the macromolecule, or the polymer. A polymer is, in the simplest, most fundamental terms, a giant molecule formed by linking together thousands of smaller, identical molecules, called monomers, into a long, repeating chain. One might imagine it as a microscopic daisy chain of chemical paperclips stretching on into infinity. Carothers believed that if he could engineer these giant, artificial chains in a laboratory, he could create materials that possessed extreme strength, durability, and elasticity. For years, Carothers and his team engaged in relentless trial and error. They faced explosions, toxic fumes, and countless failed experiments that resulted in sticky, useless resins that melted at the touch of a hot iron. But finally, they hit the jackpot. On May 24, 1934, after tweaking the molecular structure of polyamides, they successfully synthesized a spinnable chain using chemicals derived from benzene, a byproduct of coal tar. They had created the world's first fully synthetic, commercially viable fiber. Before it was officially named, the internal researchers played with several creative acronyms, including the rather triumphant name DuPurin, which stood for DuPont pulls a rabbit out of nitrogen, nature, nozzles, and naphtha. Ultimately, they settled on a simpler, sleeker name that would change the world forever. They called it nylon. The announcement of nylon was poised to be a global sensation, but it was nearly derailed by one of the weirdest, most morbid rumors in the history of science. Shortly after the discovery of this miraculous new synthetic fiber, a truly bizarre story began to circulate in the national press. Newspapers published sensational articles claiming that this new synthetic silk was manufactured using a chemical called cadaverine. For the uninitiated listener, cadaverine is exactly what it sounds like. It is a foul-smelling diamine compound produced by the putrefaction of animal tissue. It is literally the chemical that gives rotting corpses their distinctive, nauseating stench. Because the chemical precursors of nylon were structurally related to this compound, the public leaped to the horrifying conclusion that DuPont was somehow harvesting dead bodies to make women's hosiery. This macabre rumor was severely compounded by a tragic, heartbreaking reality. Wallace Carothers, the brilliant mind behind the invention, suffered from severe, lifelong clinical depression. He doubted his own abilities and felt he had run out of ideas. On April 28, 1937, just 16 months before nylon was officially announced to the public, Carothers took his own life by drinking a cocktail of lemon juice and potassium cyanide in a Philadelphia hotel room. Faced with a public relations nightmare involving rumors of rotting flesh and the actual tragic death of their star scientist, DuPont panicked. They needed to convince the American public that this material was clean, sanitary, and entirely wholesome. A woman even marched up to a lead scientist at DuPont, demanding to know the truth about the cadavers. In response, DuPont launched an aggressive, relentless marketing campaign, explicitly stating that nylon was a pure, hygienic miracle derived solely from three completely innocent ingredients: coal, air, and water. The campaign worked brilliantly. At the 1939 World's Fair in New York, DuPont showcased nylon at their Wonder World of Chemistry exhibit to an estimated 1.5 million visitors. In Los Angeles, they erected a grotesque 35-foot-tall giant disembodied leg and suspended a famous Hollywood actress from a construction crane just to show off the sleek, flawless finish of a nylon stocking. The public went wild for it. When nylon stockings were officially released to the national market on May 15, 1940, they sold out across the entire country by noon. But nylon was just the beginning of the chemical age. The textile alchemists at DuPont realized that if they could make smooth, silky threads for women's hosiery, they could also manipulate the chemistry to create fluffy, bulky yarns for sweaters and blankets. They wanted to conquer the winter apparel market. They wanted to make wool obsolete. This soaring ambition led to the creation of acrylic yarn. If the listener happens to be wearing an acrylic sweater, or perhaps sitting under a commercially produced, mass-market Afghan right now, they might want to brace themselves for the reality of what they are actually touching. Acrylic is, fundamentally, a wearable fossil fuel. It is spun from a synthetic polymer called polyacrylonitrile, pronounced polyacrylonitrile. To turn prehistoric dinosaur sludge into a fluffy, pastel pink baby booty, the chemical industry engages in a process that borders on science fiction. The journey begins at a towering petroleum refinery, where crude oil is heated and cracked under immense pressure to separate it into its various fractions. One of these byproducts is propylene gas. Through a highly toxic, deeply complex reaction involving ammonia and oxygen, this gas is converted into acrylonitrile, a volatile, hazardous liquid. In a massive chemical plant, this liquid undergoes the magic of polymerization. Chemical catalysts are added, and the individual, free-floating molecules of acrylonitrile are forced to link arms, creating long, solid chains of polyacrylonitrile. At this point in the journey, the material is a fine, white, solid plastic powder. But one cannot knit with powder. It must be turned into a continuous thread. To achieve this, the plastic powder is dumped into a vat of powerful industrial solvents, most commonly chemicals like dimethylformamide, pronounced dimethylformamide, which aggressively dissolves the solid plastic into a thick, highly viscous, honey-like syrup. Now comes the mechanical magic. This toxic plastic syrup is pumped under high pressure toward a device called a spinneret. A spinneret looks very much like a microscopic metal showerhead, perforated with thousands of infinitesimally small holes. In the most common manufacturing method, known appropriately as wet spinning, this showerhead is submerged entirely in a chemical coagulation bath. Imagine the scene inside the machinery. The viscous plastic syrup is forced through the tiny holes of the spinneret directly into the chemical bath. The instant the syrup hits the liquid environment, the solvents diffuse rapidly away, and the liquid streams instantly coagulate and solidify into thousands of continuous, solid plastic filaments. It is the chemical equivalent of making a funnel cake at a county fair, but instead of delicious fried dough, the result is extruded, wearable petroleum. These freshly born plastic filaments are then grabbed by rapidly spinning rollers and stretched, sometimes up to 10 times their original length. This violent stretching forces the chaotic polymer molecules inside the thread to align perfectly parallel to one another, granting the fiber immense tensile strength. Finally, because raw plastic thread is smooth, shiny, and slippery, the fibers are fed through a machine that violently crimps them, bending the plastic into microscopic zigzags. This crimping is the final, crucial illusion. It mimics the natural texture and wave of sheep's wool, allowing the fibers to trap pockets of air and feel soft, warm, and fluffy to the human hand. The fibers are then cut, spun together, dyed in vats of intensely bright, fade-resistant synthetic colors, and wound into the familiar, affordable skeins sold at local craft stores. It is a triumph of human ingenuity and chemical engineering. DuPont trademarked their new acrylic wonder fiber as Orlon in the late 1940s, marketing it as the ultimate wash-and-wear fabric. But as the 1950s bled into the 1960s, and these synthetic yarns flooded the consumer market, humanity was about to discover the deeply uncomfortable, highly volatile physical consequences of wrapping the mammalian body in spun plastic. The itch, the spark, and the torch. The human body is a magnificent, perpetually leaking furnace. To maintain a core internal temperature of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, the skin constantly releases heat and moisture into the environment. Even when a person is sitting perfectly still in a chair, reading a book, they are sweating. This invisible, highly active layer of air trapped between the surface of the skin and the clothing one wears is referred to by textile scientists and dermatologists as the human microclimate. For millennia, humans regulated this vital microclimate using natural fibers like wool, linen, and cotton. Animal and plant fibers are inherently porous and hydrophilic, meaning they love water. When a body clad in a wool sweater begins to sweat, the wool fibers absorb the moisture into their core and slowly wick it away to the outside air, allowing the microclimate to remain relatively dry, temperate, and comfortable. But in the mid-20th century, millions of people suddenly began encasing themselves in acrylic sweaters, polyester suits, and nylon shirts. These synthetic fibers are inherently hydrophobic. They actively repel water. They are, at a microscopic level, solid, impermeable plastic tubes. When a human body wrapped in an acrylic sweater begins to perspire, the moisture has absolutely nowhere to go. It hits the plastic barrier and stops. The human microclimate quickly degrades into a sweltering, humid, sticky swamp. And where there is trapped heat and moisture, there is life. The human skin is crawling with bacteria, specifically, distinct communities of staphylococci and micrococci. Sweat itself is virtually odorless. It is merely water, salt, and trace amounts of proteins and lipids. But the bacteria living on the skin view these proteins as a glorious, all-you-can-eat buffet. As they consume the sweat trapped against the body by the non-breathable plastic yarn, the bacteria excrete volatile organic compounds. In a fascinating, albeit somewhat revolting, line of recent research, scientists at the University of Alberta actually soaked different textiles in simulated artificial sweat to see exactly how they react. They discovered that synthetic fibers like polyester and acrylic act like microscopic sponges for these odorous compounds. The plastic fibers selectively absorb and harbor the foul-smelling molecules, binding to them so tightly that even a vigorous trip through the washing machine cannot entirely banish the stench. This is the scientific reason why a vintage 1970s acrylic sweater often carries an immortal, ghostly funk that simply cannot be eradicated. The wearer is trapped in a non-breathable plastic terrarium, stewing in their own bacterial exhaust. But the pervasive, lingering odor was only the first of the sensory assaults brought on by the synthetic revolution. There was also the terrifying, deeply annoying reality of the spark. Has the listener ever dragged their socked feet across a carpeted room, reached for a metal doorknob, and received a painful, audible zap of electricity? That is the triboelectric effect in action, and the popularization of synthetic yarn turned everyday living rooms into high-voltage hazard zones. The phenomenon of static electricity has been documented since 585 BCE, when the Greek philosopher Thales of Miletus noticed that rubbing a piece of fossilized tree resin, amber, with animal fur caused the amber to inexplicably attract light objects like feathers and dust. What Thales did not know was that he was violently tearing subatomic particles away from their native atoms. Everything in the universe is made of atoms, which consist of positive protons and negative electrons. Some materials naturally want to give up their electrons, while others greedily want to hoard them. When two different materials are rubbed together, a process called contact electrification or triboelectric charging, electrons are physically ripped from the surface of one material and deposited onto the other. Acrylic, nylon, and polyester are highly electronegative insulators. They are incredibly skilled at stealing electrons, but because they are plastic and do not absorb any moisture from the air to conduct the charge away, the electrons simply cannot flow or dissipate. The electrical charge simply builds and builds on the surface of the garment, waiting for a chance to escape. Imagine a scene from 1974. A teenager is lounging on a synthetic polyester carpet, wrapped tightly in a neon green, heavily textured acrylic afghan. Every time they shift their weight, the friction between the plastic carpet and the plastic yarn rips trillions of electrons free. The acrylic afghan acts as a massive electrical sponge, accumulating an enormous negative charge. The teenager, insulated by the yarn, is now carrying an electrostatic potential of up to 20,000 volts. If that teenager stands up and reaches a hand toward their unsuspecting sibling, the air between their finger and the sibling's arm suddenly undergoes a catastrophic dielectric breakdown. The air itself is ripped apart into a superheated plasma channel, allowing the electrons to violently leap across the gap in a microscopic bolt of lightning. A blue-white spark flashes, a sharp crack echoes in the room, and the sibling yelps in pain. While the amperage is far too low to stop a human heart, the voltage of a 1970s acrylic afghan was more than enough to fry sensitive electronics and cause constant, clinging, crackling misery during the dry winter months. But an irritating shock and a clinging skirt were absolutely nothing compared to the true, nightmarish danger lurking in the early days of synthetic yarn: extreme flammability. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, a horrifying epidemic began to emerge across the United States. Peddlers and department stores were selling incredibly soft, fluffy sweaters made from brushed viscose rayon and early acrylic blends. To achieve that highly desirable, cloud-like softness, the synthetic fibers were heavily brushed during manufacturing to raise a fuzzy pile on the surface, creating millions of microscopic air pockets. These garments became known in the press, and later in the panicked halls of Congress, by a chilling, highly accurate moniker: torch sweaters. Because the synthetic fibers were so incredibly fine, so heavily oxygenated by the fluffy pile, and entirely devoid of natural moisture, they were essentially wearable kindling. If a person wearing a torch sweater struck a match to light a cigarette in a theater lobby, or stood a fraction of an inch too close to a kitchen stove while cooking dinner, the stray heat would instantly ignite the fuzzy surface. The flame would not burn slowly. It would flash burn across the entire garment in a fraction of a second, engulfing the wearer in an explosive, terrifying fireball. Police chiefs and fire commissioners likened the ignition of these garments to lighting a barrel of gunpowder. The sheer horror of these fires was compounded by the chemical nature of the synthetics themselves. When natural fibers like cotton or wool catch fire, they burn, char, and turn to ash. When acrylic or nylon catches fire, it does not ash, it melts. The burning sweater would turn into a boiling, flaming, liquid plastic syrup that adhered directly to the victim's skin, continuing to burn deeply into the flesh even as bystanders frantically tried to strip the garment away. The gruesome injuries and tragic fatalities caused by these exploding sweaters, along with a series of highly publicized incidents involving children's brushed rayon cowboy chaps catching fire, provoked a massive, nationwide public outcry. The crisis was so severe that it prompted the United States Congress to intervene, passing the Flammable Fabrics Act of 1953. This landmark legislation mandated rigorous flammability testing, involving a specialized 45-degree angle burning chamber, effectively outlawing the manufacture and sale of the most dangerously combustible brushed synthetics. Yet, despite the unbreathable sweat, the immortal odor, the high-voltage static shocks, and the lingering threat of spontaneous combustion, the synthetic revolution simply could not be stopped. The chemical miracle had permanently altered the fabric of society, paving the way for a massive cultural shift that would change the very definition of knitting forever. The suburban shift. To comprehend the sheer magnitude of the change that occurred in the mid-20th century, the listener must look at the cold, hard economic reality of clothing. For thousands of years of human history, clothing was incredibly expensive and immensely labor-intensive. One had to raise a sheep, shear the sheep, scour the greasy wool, card the wool, spin the wool into yarn on a wheel, and finally spend weeks knitting that yarn into a single sweater. It was an investment of time that modern humans can scarcely comprehend. But following the end of World War II, the great industrial machinery that had been churning out nylon parachutes, heavy wool uniforms, and canvas tents pivoted sharply back to the consumer market. The invention of synthetic fibers like acrylic and polyester, combined with massive advancements in automated, commercial circular knitting machines, meant that clothing could suddenly be mass-produced at an unbelievably cheap cost. By the 1950s and 1960s, a person could walk into a brightly lit department store and buy a perfectly uniform, brilliantly colored machine-knit cardigan for a fraction of the cost, and an infinitesimal fraction of the time that it would take to hand-knit one at home. This new economic reality triggered a profound, immediate existential crisis for the ancient craft of knitting. Suddenly, the driving, desperate motivation that had fueled the Great Unraveling just a few decades prior evaporated into thin air. Women no longer needed to sit by the fire, exhaustedly frogging an old, moth-eaten work sweater to ensure their family had socks for the winter. The life-or-death necessity of the craft was entirely gone. So, what exactly happens to a mandatory, millennia-old survival skill when survival is no longer the primary objective? It becomes a hobby. Freed from the grim, grinding constraints of poverty and sheer utility, knitting underwent a vibrant, chaotic, and occasionally highly questionable metamorphosis. It transitioned rapidly from a tedious chore of the working class into a creative leisure activity for the expanding, prosperous suburban middle class. And because the yarn itself was no longer limited by the natural, muted colors of sheep, alpaca, or cotton, the aesthetic possibilities exploded. The massive chemical vats of DuPont and later Canadian companies like Spinrite were churning out cheap acrylic yarns in colors that had never existed in the natural world. Acid greens, electric blues, horrifyingly bright harvest golds, and eye-searing neon oranges flooded the aisles of craft stores. The yarn was incredibly cheap, it was totally impervious to moths, and best of all, it could be thrown into the newfangled electric washing machines without shrinking or felting into a solid block. The 1950s, 60s, and 70s ushered in the golden age of leisure knitting. Craft magazines, pattern books, and how-to guides proliferated, tapping into a booming market of housewives with disposable income, free time, and a deep desire to customize their increasingly uniform suburban homes. But without the grounding, practical anchor of necessity to keep the craft in check, the published patterns became wildly, delightfully experimental. Knitting and crochet leaped off the human body and began to aggressively consume the surrounding environment. This was the era of the chevron zigzag afghan. Millions of miles of synthetic yarn were enthusiastically hooked and purled into massive, heavy, highly static couch throws that draped over every conceivable piece of furniture in middle-class America. There were patterns for pastel baby booties, matching mother-daughter twin sets, bizarre geometric ponchos, and sweaters for house pets. But perhaps nothing exemplifies this era of untethered, slightly chaotic leisure, crafting better than the American bathroom. The modern listener might look back in baffled horror, but the 1970s saw a massive, inexplicable boom in patterns for knitted and crocheted toilet seat covers. Why did humanity collectively decide that the lid of a porcelain commode required a fuzzy, neon green acrylic sweater? From a strictly hygienic standpoint, it is an objectively terrible idea. A highly textured, moisture-absorbing layer of synthetic yarn hovering directly above a flush toilet is a microbiological nightmare. But from a psychological and cultural standpoint, it makes perfect sense. The crocheted toilet seat cover was the ultimate expression of extreme, unrestrained domesticity. It was a loud, colorful declaration that the crafter had so much free time, so much cheap synthetic yarn, and so much creative energy that they could afford to clothe the indoor plumbing. It was a victory lap over the struggles of the past. This era completely redefined the knitter. The stoic, exhausted woman, unpicking the felted seams of a dirty work shirt by lamplight in the 1930s, had been replaced by the suburban hobbyist of the 1970s, happily looping violently bright plastic thread into a decorative cover for a spare roll of toilet paper. It was a profound, beautiful shift in human behavior. Knitting had successfully crossed the perilous bridge from a desperate, tedious chore to a chosen, vibrant joy. Yes, the acrylic was undeniably scratchy. Yes, it smelled faintly of trapped apocrine sweat. Yes, the friction of the Afghans could occasionally generate enough voltage to mimic a minor lightning storm in the living room. But the craft had survived the Industrial Revolution, the economic depression, and the dawn of the chemical age. It had unraveled completely, and it had been made entirely, wonderfully new.